Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Lukashenko and all of the atrocities that he has done to his own people, to the democracy that his country is upheld this whole time, in which that he rigged all of the election, in which that he caused a lot of problems towards all the protesters and those who oppose him. We don't believe in the same eyes as he does. We believe that whatever he has been doing for the past few years, up until right now when he literally just won another election, we don't concede to the fact that he is one that is a good person at all. But what we're doing this debate today, especially when it comes to EU trying to engage with Lukashenko in general, we believe that antagonizing him is one that is harmful. We believe that under our world, we should try our best to negotiate with him in terms of how we want to create diplomatic negotiations, as well as just doing policies, trade deals, and also proximate economic policies with him that can further better the situation that he has put forth for EU. Now, what does it look like in government's world, first and foremost? As apart from just having diplomatic engagements with it and just negotiations, as well as just try to give him proximate economic policies, as well as just trade deals in general, what we're going to do is we're also going to lift any sanctions, and we're going to compromise that even at the worst case scenario of what they've been trying to do in Belarus to begin with, right? But the one thing that EU won't compromise in this situation are basically human rights issues. We say that EU is one that would take a position to not let any human rights violation that can occur in our side. Now, going on to my first argument, which is how we want to de-escalate tensions between Belarus and EU. And the framing here is simple. The context of the debate that is going to happen today is going to take a look at how Belarus is one who has a very much strong figure, in which in any situations that you do, you're probably going to do something even more worse than what EU is trying to do to begin with. So in the way in which we want to win on the metric of how EU has the best strategic position to make all of these problems go away, in which it wouldn't harm EU anymore, we can take this debate. Now, the first analysis to this is that Belarus likes to strongman negotiations. It's because that Lukashenko looks as one of a strong figurement within his own country, as well as how he developed ties with Putin in general, is because of how Belarus used to be a former Soviet Union, right? This means that whatever Belarus is doing, or whatever Lukashenko wants to do towards EU in general, whatever it is that EU would like to retaliate towards him as well, Lukashenko will definitely attack back. This is what happens when EU first sanctioned Belarus for all the atrocities that he's done, in which he orchestrated his own immigrant crisis onto EU that damages EU internally. The problems of EU doing such sanctions to begin with is, of course, in the minds of trying to ensure that Belarus doesn't go any step further. But from this analysis, we can see how Belarus is one that doesn't even care about anything and will just do whatever he needs to ensure that he gets what he wants. What does it mean for EU now, right? Because we say that at the point where EU actually sanctioned Belarus, it actually worsens EU's situation. EU has a very huge history of dealing with a lot of the bad shit that has happened in the past. First and foremost, when it comes to the Greece financial crisis, EU had to fork out a lot of money because Greece had to default, in which they want to regain back the economic strength towards Greece to ensure that the EU itself can run progressively. Prior to that, after that happened, the whole immigrant crisis happened in 2015, which it affected EU in general. That affected more than just about how countries who were being flooded with a lot of refugees in general, as well as the economic repercussions that happened because of that. And on top of that, recently after the whole Brexit has occurred to begin with, EU also faced a lot of the economic repercussions of what Brexit entails towards EU in general. This shows that EU right now is having a lot of problem in the plate. And one thing that EU shouldn't do strategically is to basically have Belarus retaliate them even further. What this means is that what EU has to do best is basically dealing diplomatically is the best strategy for EU to have in general. Because what negotiations allow us to do is to know what Lukashenko actually wants. Because as of right now, Lukashenko hasn't made any statements as to what he personally wants from EU. But one thing is clear is that Lukashenko doesn't like the way EU is interfering with how he handles his business within the country. At the very best in our world, we can say that we can attain such changes without actually having Belarus to strike back, even worse than what the immigrant crisis is already going to happen towards EU to begin with. Before I move on, any POIs?
We already know what Lukashenko wants, which is that sanctions are released. If you're willing to compromise sanctions, but you are still willing to have Lukashenko as president, all the human rights harms exist anyway.
Okay, but it's because of what I said about how EU is facing a lot of shit that's happening right now. Even right now with the whole Brexit thing, is actually putting the progression of the economic power backwards. This is one where EU has to basically take a stand in which, even though EU is seen as probably the greatest bastion in regards to human rights, but what happens if Belarus were to do the immigration crisis to begin with again, a lot of the things that would affect EU status as one of the best economic blocs in the world. This means that EU has to strategically probably make a few concessions in which they can probably remain their own position, which they can deal with amongst other EU countries that they are in dealing with to begin with, right? Now, what is the comparative that we're coming from under our world, right? We say that at the very least, opposition needs to defend a world where EU status, as that what I said just now about how EU is being one of the best bastions of human rights to begin with, about how they created policies to ensure that human rights will never be violated to begin with. Opposition has to defend at the point where Belarus will actually retaliate to create even more humanitarian crisis. This means that EU will probably have to fork out a lot of more money or just make a lot of concessions in general in which they will compromise EU's strength in terms of financially and even just all the, troops that they have within their own allies, which is one that is going to damage EU even further. And on top of that, you also have to deal with what Russia might do to you. Because the problem right now, as of right now, what Belarus is proposing to do is to basically just cut off the gas that literally directs towards EU in general. What this means is you're going to affect a lot of these countries within the EU itself that probably need the gas to run their own business. This trickles down to the effect of how EU is going to basically lose a lot of revenue, in which now they will lose a lot of positions in their own economic power, right? At the very least, under our world, we say that even at the worst case scenario in government, we get to at least ensure that EU is one that is not compromised to begin with. Because we say at any point of time, we probably couldn't invade Belarus, in which it would probably cause more catastrophe to begin with, because of how Belarus has a good tie with Russia to begin with. At the end of the day, the framing here is simple. We simply want to de-escalate the situation between EU and Belarus to begin with, to ensure that everything can possibly run, or even at the very least, is much better than status quo. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Inviting Leader of Opposition, here.
Audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Thanks. Give me a sec. I prefer gender pronouns is they, them. I prefer POI through chat. I'll take from CG, hopefully by 5. Begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I just want to know what Lukashenko actually wants and want EU to actually fulfill what Lukashenko wants. I think the problem with their whole case is about they literally are enabling Lukashenko to continue to actually become a regime within the country itself. Let's just paint a bit how harmful it is for us to enable Lukashenko in the first place. Lukashenko literally tried to rig the election itself. They try to harm the country itself by not having a democracy. They literally do everything that they can to actually make sure that they are able to stay within the power itself. We think that's very harmful for you to continue to actually pend it towards Lukashenko itself, right? There will be 4 things in this speech. Firstly, framing and responses to Adam. Secondly, why exactly that is important for EU to not actually cooperate with the immoral actor. Thirdly, why exactly it will harm the EU's credibility as an actor. And finally, how exactly it legitimizes Lukashenko as a whole, right? Firstly, on framing, I would like to point out that when it comes to this invasion and negotiation itself, I'm pretty sure that it's not going to work to bring down Lukashenko. We kind of have to concede that, right? But the key thing to note here is that this is about how we are able to actually have a moral signaling in the first place. It is about how exactly or what exactly you should do and should act as an actor when it comes to negotiation and when it comes to dealing with this kind of actor in the first place, we say that EU are the only actor that are able to actually contain Belarus and also Lukashenko simply because of the fact that they are the one who have the power and they are the most proximate to these people in the first place. Note that Belarus' only allies are literally Russia, right? We don't think that Russia is probably going to help them in their best case scenario to actually like suddenly attack or like try to go against EU itself. We think that's very harmful for them to say that in the first place, right? But we also want to know that EU are literally morally and also ideologically irreconcilable with EU. We think that it's far more important for us to actually continue to antagonize them until to a point where they actually try to change in the first place, right? What does this antagonizing means? That firstly, I would suggest that it probably looks like sanction, but it wouldn't stop there only, right? It probably looks like criticizing them and condemning them and holding their action to accountable. But note that it doesn't preclude any negotiation with these people with Belarus or like Lukashenko in the first place. The fact is, the key difference here is that when it comes to this negotiation, we're saying that if Lukashenko want to actually negotiate with EU, it's fine. But we're not going to negotiate with them. We're not going to try to attempt to negotiate with them first place. They have to make a move at the point where they feel the pain from the sanction itself, right? Let's do a couple of things that Adam said. Number one, he says that it will worsen the EU. I would like to point out that the only power that the Belarus has against EU in the first place is literally the immigrant crisis, right? I would like to point out like the amount of money, the amount of like immigrant exists within like the power that it can use to actually goes against EU are literally like just a couple of thousands, like 20,000 of immigrants. Note that this number itself is not really that big, and the fact that I think that EU has dealt with far worse immigrant crisis in the first place. We think that EU can actually continue to deal with this, but maybe they can just argue that by the economic terms that maybe it will harm EU in the first place. I would like to point out that right now EU are literally going to do a specific economic sanction against Belarus in the first place to ensure that we are able to maximize the sanction and also the attacks against the Belarus without actually harming our economy itself. We think that's far more important in the first place. But secondly, Adam just said that the gas crisis happens. I would like to point out, if we just continue this to happen, the fact that we are just like we just concede to the idea that this is the bargaining chip that exists within the Belarus against the EU itself. We think it's far harmful if you allow Belarus to actually continue to use this as a bargaining chip. But let's flip this for a bit, right? I think that it's important for you to note when it comes to this, when it comes to EU, I think the sanction itself harms those Belarus in the first place. We think they're probably going to actually negotiate with us far faster. Firstly, then, why exactly we think that EU should actually not cooperate, with the immoral actors in the first place? This argument is just to prove that EU shouldn't succumb to the power of the immoral actor in the first place. There are three analyses to this, right? Number one, we think that when it comes to cooperation itself, we are literally conceding to the idea that they have power against us. That is to say that we are saying that Lukashenko have power against EU because we are willing to actually concede against them. Why is this important then? Because this literally makes them feel like they are stronger than EU in the first place, and that is to say they will be able to do it again in the future because of the fact that they feel like EU will listen to them in the future. We think that's very harmful because you allow more immoral actors to act like that in the future. But secondly, in fact, this is important because there's a lot of like regime that exists in the first place that EU have a stance against them in the first place. Let us say that EU already against the Hungary itself because they are act of like anti-LGBT in the first place, right? They suspend the voting ability for Hungary when it comes to the EU itself. We think that it's important for them to continue to actually do that, because if suddenly Belarus gets some kind of exception in the first place, that means that a lot of like regime will actually continue to make a force make stronger because they know that they are able to get this exception because EU simply will just like bend down at the point where they are being attacked by very hard pressure in the first place. Lastly, it's emboldened the regime itself because the fact is we are saying that we are not against the Lukashenko and his regime in the first place. We are saying it's fine for you to become a regime. This is very harmful because you literally, as an EU, as a moral bastion, you are saying that it's fine for you to become a regime in the country. We think it harms those people. You allow those people in the first place. All of these analysis prove that you shouldn't actually negotiate with this or cooperate with these people in the first place because it will further harm the country and further harms the people itself, and on principle level it's very harmful. Before I move on, sure, CJ.
Given that you are relying on Belarus to listen to you once the sanction impacts them, when do you think that is going to happen, given the fact that more sanctions have been added, but they are still heavily reliant on the current process of doing things?
Look, I think that you are confusing a bit. Our case is literally says that what EU should do. The key things to say here is that we're saying that EU should hold their principle that says that you cannot be an immoral actor in the first place. The second the second part of the case is to say that we can actually like reduce because like EU actually is a very strong actor, and EU can actually reduce like literally the sanction itself actually harms the Belarus. I'm pretty sure in the future Belarus will have to consider, because they will harm the country itself, right? Secondly, EU credibility will be tarnished in the first place. Note that EU is actually a moral bastion, like the most credible moral bastion in the first place. If EU suddenly make an exception like against Belarus in the first place, a lot of like this credibility as EU as an actor will be questioned in the first place. That's to say that a lot of our foreign policies are actually supporting for the human rights itself. We think that what's going to happen is that you are less likely to get the cooperation from the EU members simply because of the fact that they don't feel like you are credible to actually hold this power in the first place. They don't feel like you are actually a good actor or like a good actor to actually make sure that everything is whole in control and accountable in the first place. And for all those reasons, OO takes this bit.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. Inviting Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Let me just arrange my notes. Okay. Sharing my space in 3, 2, 1. Panel, it's important to understand that opening opposition wants to come in this debate and play the moral high ground about, oh, we have to be the, the moral actor that actually take care of the like global moral incentive of other people whatsoever. Okay, but few responses to opening opposition, right? Firstly, the mechanism that you're proposing is one that firstly that had been done before, does not work, cause crisis in the EU and cause heightened issue in the region in the first place. So tell me, why are you defending something that has been done before and clearly doesn't work? And then other responses include that this hardline stance from EU is going to harm EU in itself, and this is the whole argument that I'm trying to bring today. And secondly, is about under opposition world, negotiation is less likely to happen, because I understand that opposition wants to say that, okay, we don't want to negotiate with Belarus, but if Lukashenko wants it, then he can. First thing is, Lukashenko is a dictator. Like human rights abuse happen in his state. So like, why would he care about anything that happened in the EU in the first place? So what is the incentive that the Lukashenko would actually would want to negotiate with you in the first place? Because we already concede that negotiation is one that is good. And also because when opening opposition say this, it's important that they also value the importance of negotiation in the first place. Okay, so few arguments that I have for today is firstly about the practical argument about the higher intensity of retaliation from Belarus is going to harm the EU in the first place. So let's characterize this, right? There's two things under my characterization, which is about the energy importance and as well as the economical importance. OO wants to say that, okay, like Belarus has no importance for EU at all, but we say no, that is not the truth. The truth is there's an energy importance that Belarus served to EU in the first place. This looks at the natural gas pipeline from Russia that goes through goes through Belarus before reaching EU. So this natural gas pipeline is the main source of energy for the EU. So the current context is Lukashenko has the power and the capacity to block the gas pipeline from benefiting EU. We say that this antagonizing paradigm would incentivize Lukashenko to actually materialize this and actually block this accessibility to main power in the first place. And this is going to harm EU because, EU is a small country and largely depends on this source of energy. And then the secondly is about the economical importance. I understand the opening opposition want to give sanction. So this sanction of like hardline mechanism, the opposition wants to bring to like economic sanction, meaning that trade could not happen between Belarus and EU. So this would actually harm both sides. So, but let's talk about EU, right? So Belarus has actually exported like a lot of goods to EU, and we are actually seeing the harms of this retaliation from this sanction as it like really harms the EU economically in the first place, because they're not gonna able to access the goods that they need from Belarus, which looks like wood, something like that, I believe. Okay, so that's the first argument, right? Basically saying Belarus has importance to EU and EU has to give in to this Belarus in the first place through negotiation. Okay, and then secondly is about the migrant crisis, which is the worst thing that could happen to EU right now. So understand that Belarus is using refugees as a mean of retaliation to oppose EU, and this happens because of the sanction before, which is why I keep saying why you want to do something that is obviously hurting the EU. Okay, so few reasons why this is bad. Okay, 3 reasons. Firstly, is the migration of migration of refugees cause socio-economical problems in the EU. So this looks like EU doesn't really have the capacity to deal with the heightened crime or heightened microaggressions that happen because of this refugees crisis in the first place. And then the second layer is about the political climate of the EU itself. Understand that 2015 migrant crisis was the turning point for EU, as members of EU are resistant towards the immigrant in the first place. So the impact to this is we are seeing events like Brexit and Brexit happening. So this would actually harm EU, because like members of EU who are not agreeing with this taking in migrants would actually leave EU, and that is what we have been seeing. So this is bad, because now EU is more like cracking down. And then thirdly, resources of EU is now diverted to curb the refugee crisis. So most EU members are dealing with shaky public finance. We know that. So, and actually in Finland, we are seeing like basically Finland is not agreeing with the refugees coming in. So what actually happened is that EU decides to reallocate the asylum seekers currently in Italy and Greece. So this actually proves that EU does not have the capacity, interest, or basically basic ones to deal with the refugees crisis in the first place. Now the question becomes, how does OG mitigate refugees crisis? Listen, we're not going to solve it like 100%. We know we cannot do that, but we can at least mitigate the refugee crisis. So we can do this by compromising with Belarus, because we say that Belarus is the cause of the refugees crisis in the first place. So this looks like what Belarus actually do is lighten the visa application. This looks like people from Middle East like Syria and Iran or Iraq can just come in to Belarus, and they're going to be transited in Belarus before going into the EU. And Belarus also equip immigrants with necessary tools that could actually help them to break the border. So we say that this shows that Belarus has been using these immigrants as a bait, as a fight to show that they're fighting against EU over the sanctions coming from them. So when we actually leave the sanction, Belarus has now have no reason or incentive to use immigrant as a mean of retaliation. If you think about it logically, the reason why Belarus do this is because they dislike the sanction in the first place. So why not just leave the sanction, and then they're not gonna do the whole migrant crisis thing in the first place, right? Okay, so negotiation, what looks like EU has to understand Belarus' interest, which is not wanting the sanction in the first place. So the impact of this is lesser refugees crisis. We could at least mitigate that. Now the question becomes, how does the weighing or the moral thing coming from OO like weight with the whole interest coming from OG? Okay, I understand that OG wants to leave the sanction and OO don't want to do that because they believe that they have to play the moral high ground. Two reasons or two responses to this. Firstly, nations are bounded to sovereignty, and all the adjacent states should respect the sovereignty of a state. And understand that Lukashenko has the power to do anything within his state. And secondly, is Belarus is not part of the EU in the first place, meaning that according to law, EU doesn't really have an obligation to cater on what's happening in the Belarus in the first place. And clearly, this hardline sanctions or this hardline mechanism that EU has been doing clearly harm you in the first place. So we say, why not leave something that is not even your obligation to do with, because it's clearly harming you, and actually negotiate with Belarus in the first place. So clearly, we are better for the reasons that we actually want to leave the sanction, because we believe that the sanction is the thing that are causing a lot of problems in the EU right now, and have been brought to propose.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Inviting Deputy Leader of Opposition to end opening half of the debate. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. Just give me a minute. I need to set. My papers are just a bit messy. Give me 1 sec.
No problem.
I'll be starting my speech in. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Government side, in order for them to win this debate, they have to defend why negotiations with a legitimate dictator who said he's the last dictator in Europe has to defend on why negotiations with this guy and giving him legitimacy by opting into the negotiation is better than under our where we antagonize him in the first place. The problem with government side today is they don't understand the context of why we antagonize Lukashenko to begin with. That the tipping point of the reason why we're having these negotiations was because he is a legitimate person who bring fighter jets and who brought fighter jets to like he brought he basically what he did he got used fighter jets and tried and did it to his political opponent named Raman Petrovic. The reason why this is so compelling was that Raman Petrovic was just using an airline, was using a commercial airline to just pass through the area, and it was detained because Belarus had information that was going to pass through the airline, and Belarus legitimately used fighter jets to begin so. So in an effort for EU to respond to this, EU has to legitimately use sanctions and antagonize Lukashenko to do so, because Lukashenko in itself is one that has legitimately used hybrid warfare as what opening government concedes in this debate. This is an individual who uses migrant crisis in order to legitimize himself and in order to destabilize the European Union as a whole. The problem within this debate is that Russia as an ally within Lukashenko to begin so means that if Lukashenko wins in this debate, and if we say that Lukashenko, we should negotiate with Lukashenko and see what he wants, you legitimize his ideology and you legitimize his dictatorship within the country in itself. So what happens under their world, ladies and gentlemen, is you're only going to get a stalemate between what happened between the negotiations of Lukashenko, what Lukashenko wants. Because the problem within today's debate, and like whole opening government just uses this idea of resources, but the problem here is this debate isn't about resources, but rather yet on should we legitimize a leader who actively use tactics to actively use hybrid warfare by using migrants as its own aim to actually do this crisis to do so. This debate is about resources because the migrant crisis now is so different to the 2015 migrant crisis, where it was 1.3 million migrants. This is a 20,000 migrant crisis. We can deal with it much more better. What's the problem with this, with government side today? In order for government to win this, they have to prove to you how negotiations with Lukashenko as a leader, how they're willing to actually legitimize how Lukashenko is willing to deal with them on the same table to begin so. Why is this important, right? Because Lukashenko in itself, the reason why he's doing this is because Russia and it's is a part of the Kremlin's plan to destabilize the European Union as a whole. The reason why they want a reaction to Poland is because the Kremlin in itself has legitimate like enemy ties towards Poland in itself. Like they want to destabilize the European Union. Giving the ideology and conceding to this by not conceding to this ideology and conceding that that Lukashenko is too powerful for the EU to handle gives you a bad legitimate idea, because European Union as a bloc has been known as a bastion for democracy to do so. European Union literally before Lukashenko like did the fighter jet thing, he was democratic with this Belarus to begin so, but to the point that Belarus enacted this fighter jets to stop a Ryanair airplane. Because that guy only wanted to go on a holiday with his girlfriend, he had to be stopped and he legitimately pled to the Lion Air people that said, I'm going to die if you don't help me. This is a legitimate concern, and European Union had to react because this shows that Belarus as a dictator has legitimately used these ideologies, and if EU doesn't respond, it just gives you a bad image, right? EU didn't respond to when Belarus legitimately did a human rights abuse, and legitimately you're going to do it even much more further in the future. Why is that problematic? Under that world, what you're going to have is you're going to deal with the dictator, and when you give this legitimate ideology, what happens then? Right, the reason why sanctions work, and this is what's so important with the Haikal speech. Haikal specifically explained to you the reason why we sanction this country is because you destabilize the Belarus as itself. The Belarus as a country is extremely falling because of these sanctions. The reason why they opt into hybrid warfare is because they realized that sanctions was too much and they needed hybrid warfare to be orchestrated to destabilize the European Union to actually get some certain leverage as a do so. The reason why we don't negotiate terrorists as well is the same principle applies here. If you negotiate with him, you give them legitimate ideologies. And what happens in the best case scenario is what happens in sanctions, right? This is negotiations, what happens, right? Best case scenario, if we actually get negotiations, and the worst case scenario under if we don't do inaugurations and we just do sanctions, we realize that Lukashenko, the worst case scenario is we just realize we get the migrant crisis. But what happens then? We understand that Lukashenko, as a dictator who legitimately orchestrated this whole move, the Kremlin, which is Russia, like that did this whole move, are a legitimately bad actor to begin so. The problem with this, you legitimize the ideology and you make Belarus stronger because Belarus in itself does this wrong. But before I go on, I'll take CG.
Yeah, so your solvency is to ensure that citizens in Belarus starve so that it's more destabilized. What are they going to do then if they can't even have a free and fair election? What's going to happen?
Okay, the problem with your world, you're telling me Lukashenko, who's a dictator, who legitimately used fake elections to get past his regime in itself, that if Lukashenko in itself wins and tells individuals that we were able to destabilize the European Union, he wouldn't use this ideology to say, oh, that I'm not really legitimately a bad guy. That the reason if you feed to this ideology, if you tell this, if you you won't win under that side as well. What happens then is you just get a stalemate. You don't even get a stalemate in this ideology. The problem with that case is that under their world, ladies and gentlemen, that we truly understand that if the migrant crisis did not if we concede that the migrant crisis happened, we conceded that Lukashenko did this and orchestrated this move to destabilize the European Union as a whole. What happens then? Russia in itself is a reported ally. OG conceded to this. If Russia is a reported ally and Russia legitimately wants to destabilize the European Union as well, you lose out in that debate as well. And EU will just truly struggle to begin so. Because if you concede now, Russia knows that you're not a strong actor as you used to be because you're legitimately conceding to a country who has 20,000 people as well. The problem in this debate is that if you truly want to support, if you truly want to help these individuals, you cannot give legitimacy to the ideology of a dictatorship who legitimately does so many bad stuff in the past that use orchestrated and use lives at the end of the day. The only way to solve this is you antagonize this individual, because antagonizing actually shows how this individual is a bad person and helps the EU grow as a whole. This is why opening opposition takes this debate.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition. To begin the closing half of the debate, inviting the member here.
Hello, am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. I have no preferred gender pronouns, PR preferences in the chat. Thank you. I think the only thing that happened in the opening exchange is why our approach is good. I don't think they explained enough about what the outcomes are and why these are the outcomes they're willing to defend. If you listen to opening opposition, their outcome is simply to maintain sanctions, and the result of this is going to be in the far future, Lukashenko will have to give up and then will do things better. I'm unsure as to why A, this is a desirable outcome, but B, this is an outcome that will even happen, because given context about how Lukashenko has allies with Russia, the fact that they are an important gas pipeline for Belarus from the EU to Russia, and the fact that he is a dictator that does not care that his people are suffering, means that this is something that he can do for a prolonged period of time, even though sanctions have been added a couple of weeks ago. All of this goes to show you that their best case is the migrant crisis. Their worst case is if Lukashenko becomes more aggravated and exacerbates the crisis even further. I don't think opposition can run away with the context that it's just 20,000 migrants. EU has dealt with worse before, when that is not true. Political fighting is happening in the European Parliament. The opposition leader from the Belarus is claiming that people are dying on the streets by the tens every day. And the fact that even in the best case, and Belarus restricts or acquiescence to the demands of European Union, they're not going to take back 11,000 migrants and then resend them to Iraq, Syria, and wherever they came from. The fact that this is a problem that already exists means that this is something that never should have happened. That is why CG will take the additional burden to talk to you about how we will reimagine the world in which sanctions were never placed in the first place. Because even if you buy opposition's outcomes that sanctions are the only way to punish individuals that are dictators, the conclusion of that argument or outcome is nothing will change. because the people that are trapped in the borders of Poland and Europe today are individuals that never should have been there in the first place, because they are not guilty of this useless war that's happening between Lukashenko and Europe. Bottom line is, this is not about lifting sanctions. This is about negotiating from the point in which we decided to put sanctions in the first place. What does this mean? Firstly, in framing, there's no outcome in which Lukashenko will become Barack Obama or whatever benevolent leader you have at the top of your head. This is solely about how we can coincide Lukashenko's massive ego and self-interested propaganda with EU's interests with protecting individuals on the ground as well. At any point in which we show you that to some extent these two things can happen with one approach, we take the debate. How did we do this better? How are we going to do this better than opening government? Because if you notice, all you hear from OG is about how this is important or how this would have been a necessity at that time. But I don't think they show you why Lukashenko is going to willingly negotiate with EU to the extent in which that can create better outcomes than status quo. Why is that true? Firstly, we have to analyze that sanctions were initially placed on Lukashenko back in 2011. At this point in time, Lukashenko was not antagonistic to the EU, did not have a strong relationship with Russia, and was an individual that was largely less extremist than he is now. All of the actions of sanctions and him having to go to more extreme allies in order to consolidate his position has resulted in the dictator and extremist Lukashenko that we know of today. But we are not negotiating with the Lukashenko of today. Since this is a This House regrets motion, at that point in time, negotiations would have been much easier to do, because this was an individual that did not have a strong ally in Russia, did not have a developed pipeline that EU was solely reliant on, and was not an individual that saw EU as a threat. This analysis all goes to show that it is very likely that if we had gone in with negotiations, we would have likely resulted in more in better terms, of would have positioned EU better to manage a crisis should Lukashenko become unmanageable. What would these terms would have looked like? This would have looked like no engagement with rivals of EU, or mitigated engagement with rivals of EU, or access or giving permission to EU to provide aid to Belarusian citizens, or to the very least, not pushing Belarus away, where Lukashenko uses his people on the ground to get him money somewhere or somehow. Bottom line is, the conclusion to this layer of analysis is that negotiations would have not only been possible, but to the very least allowed EU better positioning to deal with Lukashenko should he become a bigger problem in the future. In this timeline, would there be humanitarian abuses? Yes. But I think it's about scale, because if you notice, opposition or opening government does not argue about where, does not show a world where these types of abuses don't happen at all. So comparative to the side of opening opposition, where thousands of migrants are stuck, and these migrants will have no opportunity regardless of outcome in the world of opposition, we think on a comparative, this is a much better scale to be in. The last comparative I want to make with opening opposition is the fact that EU has a moral high ground and needs to hold strong on their principle, because they are the strongest and most democratically inclined bloc in the world. First of all, I'm uncertain as to why this is EU's tagline when it is not true. They have admitted multiple dictatorial economies in the past. Countries like Hungary, where there's still a crisis going on now, countries like Italy that were previously fascist, are all examples of how EU prioritizes their economic value as opposed to their political inclinations. But secondly, and more importantly, EU has also been projected to be more understanding of different political systems. What is the evidence of this? If you look at how EU has been courting Turkey for the past 5 to 6 years, a notoriously dictatorial state where Erdogan has commenced a huge war against the Kurds and Turkish supremacy, but EU still negotiates with them because they want Turkey's economic powerhouse within this region to be to benefit the EU. All of this goes to show you that these negotiations eventually will reach a stage where Turkey is admitted to the EU, but at this stage, Turkey, to the very least, has provided an opportunity to moderate its behavior. All of this analysis goes to show you that EU's ability to negotiate at a stage where these individuals are at least willing to negotiate will result in better outcomes. Through the cracks, things may fall, but this is a much better comparative in the world of opposition. Proud to propose.
Thank you, Gulf member. Inviting opposition member here. Inviting opposition member.
Hi, so sorry. Am I audible?
Yep, yes you are.
You guys in chat, preferably from OG. Firstly, I'll frame out OG, then frame out CG, and then give some vertical comparatives the opening opposition failed to impact, and then lastly, bite the bullet and say actually hard power will work in mitigating the crisis that is existing. Firstly, OG. OG says in Prime Minister that they will not compromise on human rights violations. Here are 3 reasons why Belarus will also not compromise on human rights violations, which proves that even if these negotiations happen, they would not amount to anything because Belarus is an actor that will not compromise as well. 3 reasons. Firstly, that human rights violations is exactly how they stay in power. This looks like clamping down on journalists, clamping down on opposition leaders, like literally jailing political dissidents. This proves that their human rights violation benefits Lukashenko's regime. Secondly, they're inherently a strongman regime. Using all of the analysis that's been thrown around, this just proves it is unlikely that they will actually compromise on human rights violations. But thirdly, they directly benefit from the human rights violations in terms of democracy. If opening government says that, well, the problem is we want to solve some human rights crisis, but we're also not going to back down on human rights crisis, they have to defend a world where continuously Maria Kalesnikova is consistently being charged for even any kind of action within just attacking the country. And let's just clear the BS in this entire round. The reason why these individuals or Lukashenko actually did all these things is because he wants to stay in power and he wants to actually clamp down within this power. Therefore, the act of rigging the election makes Lukashenko stay in power. Therefore, if opening government wants to never compromise on human rights, these negotiations will not work. Therefore, opening government is out of this debate. Right. What is a likely negotiation? We think that for government benefits to materialize, they want to stop the migrant crisis, right? But opening opposition's claim here is that even if you stop the migrant crisis, you have compromised so much, and at what cost? They have 3 broad benefits here. Number 1 is Lukashenko is still in power. Secondly, it sets a precedent. And thirdly, there's loss of legitimacy. We'll give you comparatives on each one because opening opposition has not done that. Before that, let's frame up closing government. They have a very interesting extension because they say, well, let's reimagine the world. So back in the days when Belarus was actually not that strong, and they say that sanctions are going to dictate the values of these negotiations, right? And sanctions never actually happen. They miss this one chunk, which means that they are conceding to the fact that the EU would never have sanctioned Lukashenko to begin with. Note that the info slide says that the reason why the EU is actually sanctioning Lukashenko to begin with is as a result of that humanitarian crisis, or not humanitarian crisis, as a result of the rigged election and the democracy and the protests, and by virtue of him being a dictator. There are 2 harms to this. Firstly, closing government's world will be in a world where sanctions would never have happened onto the stolen elections. This proves that number one, the principles of the EU would be compromised, right? EU can no longer become the bastion of human rights and can no longer impose its laws on every other country. Therefore, it loses its credibility. This piece of framing actually proves why opening opposition's claim of how credibility exists. We are using closing government's extension to frame opening opposition's arguments better. But secondly, EU would no longer be able to make moral claims in society. The reason why is because, okay, I am an EU, right? And I have human rights, and I prioritize and I enforce these policies upon my own member states, but I'm actually not sanctioning a literal dictator on my own backyard, and I'm actually giving them aid. Like what Ram says, if you're going to give them aid and if you're going to give them education and stuff like that, literally you are rewarding a dictator, but you are enforcing a mechanism, a harsh mechanism upon its own people. Which means that in this timeline that Ram says, more often than not, countries are going to break free of the EU way more. Brexit would happen more. Brexit would happen more. But secondly, they will no longer be able to hold this power within societies. They will no longer be an accountable actor. They will be a rogue actor because there is no track record of them actually being consistent with his moral claims. There is no goodwill that EU has in this world that Ram thinks would exist. Therefore, this closing government argument is actually nonsense. Now, this is not dealing with Russia. Like Russia, in the base, Russia is actually not that big of an influence in Belarus. Two reasons why this is false. Firstly, this is as a result of the Cold War. Therefore, Russia has already been funding these countries. But secondly, like Russia will consistently fund countries like Poland, like Lukashenko's regime, because they want it to be a buffer zone for Russia within that region, right? Which mitigates the harm of Russia. Like this proof. All this proves is that this closing government parallel universe is actually circumstantial at best, right? Three comparatives. Firstly, is that in the best case scenario, Belarus would have gotten much stronger without these sanctions. This looks like legitimizing Russia's hold on Belarus, right? This is a world where sanctions have never been in place. There are two harms to this. Firstly, is that principally you have turned your backs on the protesters within the EU. This looks like the EU no longer supporting the protesters and no longer wanting to fund them, which means that the attack against these elections would be comparatively way lower. Therefore, the likelihood of actual change within these countries are comparatively on a scale lower. But secondly, Russia will see this as a win because opening government and closing government says, opening government says they will concede, right? Which therefore means that Russia has won this fight on the immigration crisis, which would make the United States involved way more because of these competing hegemonies, but also because Russia has clamped down on the power within the EU and has influenced an EU policy. This is on a comparative way worse because it destabilizes the region way more. But clearly it sets a precedent. Before I move on, I'll take a PR from opening. Or closing. Okay. Precedents. Russia doesn't. Okay. Extension about how hard power works in stopping Belarus' migrant crisis. Closing government points to a fact that all opening opposition's arguments is devoid of any outcomes. We'll prove to you four mechanisms as to how hard power actually works. Firstly, Belarus is economically isolated, which means they rely on the exports of goods towards neighboring states only outside of the EU. EU is an economic powerhouse, which means sanctions would actually make them way poorer. Secondly, the migrant crisis actually shows that Lukashenko is actually desperate. So migrant crisis only happened as a result of the sanctions, right? Which means that Lukashenko is resorting to literally using refugees as a means to get some end, right? Which means that they are actually inherently weaker. And thirdly, there's inflation, right? Which means it increases the critical mass for individuals to go up against the regime. But fourthly, there have been trades where they are actually willing to have a negotiation with taking some refugees and EU taking the other refugees. All these things prove that to a certain extent, hard power has some influences upon Belarus and upon Lukashenko. Even if they're a strongman regime, they still respond to incentives. That's how we have to win this debate. Thanks so much.
Thank you, opposition member, inviting Gov Whip to end Gov Bench case. They're here.
Am I audible?
Yep, yes, you are.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. There are two fundamental differences between CG and the rest of the debate. The first is that we prove solvency or some level of solvency or some level of outcomes that we can get. Because in both worlds, things are shit. At least in our world, we have some forms of compromises and things are less bad. I'll flesh it out when I do my comparatives. The second fundamental difference is that we're not Bumiputra, but I'll focus on the first more in today's debate. I have two issues today. The first is in terms of sanctions and its effectiveness, and secondly, the comparative, which is CG's extension. Before that, just a point of response that doesn't fit in. I would just like to note that CO's extension is heavily dependent, so I'll put it in heavily dependent on opening opposition's material on sanctions and why hard power work, so I'll include that there. But one additional thing that they brought to the table is that we can help protesters to a certain extent, because in CG's world, we wouldn't have helped the protesters during this human rights violation as this is antagonistic. I think the act of EU trying to help out the protesters had a net harm towards these protesters to begin with, right? The reason why this is true is a few things. The first is that the election structures and the electoral college commissions didn't change. There was no change whatsoever. So that was all for naught. The second is that in fact, it harms protesters more, because the point at which the EU started to antagonize Belarus more is when Belarusian citizens and individuals firstly had to face the harms of sanctions, which I'll flesh out a bit more, but secondly and more importantly, they aren't able to access basic things that EU citizens can. So for example, the welfare fund that the EU has, Belarusians are banned from accessing it. And this is all just so that the EU can pretend to be a bastion of human democracy, which isn't even their main goal or isn't even their main priority to begin with. So I would say that there is a net harm, and it would have been better in this reimagined world where they did not fund the protest. First level on sanctions. The first question I ask is, will sanctions and hard power work? I just want to point out also, OO said that we will have sanctions, and secondly, we will hold them accountable. So basically, they only have one mechanism, which is sanctions, right? OG said that this won't work, and it hasn't worked. This came from DPM. CG will show you why, and we already have, but I'll categorize them into 4 reasons. The first is Russia's presence. Note that it is wrong for opening up to say that Russia wouldn't help them out as much. In fact, Russia's presence grew stronger within Belarus during the times in which sanctions were imposed, and the logic behind that is also from opening opposition, that Russia wants to have some soft power to combat the EU, right? So this looks like, and these are examples, right? Firstly, they gave more aid towards Belarusians. Second, they lowered tariffs for Belarus oil. And thirdly, that things like Lukashenko and Putin have historically had great relations with each other. This means that sanctions works to starve individuals. They aren't starving because they have some wealth and capital here. The second reason is because China is also starting to trade within Belarus, and that is still a viable trade partner outside of the EU. The third is in terms of their gas rig. So I understand opening government talked about this, but no, opening opposition in LO stated that, oh, they can't use gas because it won't be a bargaining chip anymore, because we are using hard power. I think it's the opposite, because in actuality, the gas is a leverage chip to make sure that the sanctions are hurting EU as much, because the wealth of gas that Belarus has, because they're somewhat undeveloped into using these particular natural resources, is a plus point for Belarus. The last thing is Belarus doesn't care. No, CO says that they want hard power, but the hard power can only come in sanctions, because the EU has historically never used military intervention within Belarus, number one. Number two, they would never do that simply because annexing Belarus from the EU is bad for the EU, because they want to maintain members, especially after Brexit. The conclusion here is sanctions won't work. What if they do? This is the second level. I say that if the sanctions work, it's a horrible mechanism. If it is true, which I don't think it is, and I'll disprove it later, if it is true that the EU cares so much about human rights, I think opposition team is the most performative side in terms of caring about human rights. Because in actuality, opposition is the team that's making the worst decision ever. The increase of severity of duration and the increase in duration and severity of sanctions doesn't affect the kleptocrats at the top. It doesn't affect Lukashenko. It affects all the citizens within Belarus who are trying to protest, right? So the battle of attrition is actually harming more citizens. But this is only true, or this is only viable, if the state is willing to listen towards citizens being angry. Given that the main problem is that the elections are rigged, we don't think that this mechanism is firstly fair towards individuals, because they are the ones who suffer, and they had no liberty of choice to avoid this particular human rights violation. But secondly, and more importantly, they can't do anything about it. There is no democratic process that will work for you to vote them out. Lastly, even if it works, I think it will take a damn long time. And both oppositions have to, who say that EU are bastions of human rights, have to concede that in this long duration of time, the individuals who suffer and face starvation are the individuals who are the civilians. And in this long duration of time, they have to deal with this suffering. The last thing is on moral obligation. And I just truly believe the EU doesn't really care about human rights violations as much as they posit to be. This is for a few things. The first is, even if there is a moral obligation, antagonizing bad actors doesn't necessarily mean that you isn't the only way to fulfill a moral obligation. Many countries and in terms of diplomacy can have differing views and methods in curtailing a certain regime. An example of this is how they still negotiate with Turkey. That was unresponded to. The last thing is moral obligations, if it exists, is mitigating crisis, and they didn't prove that whatsoever. So at best, they just have a stance, but that stance doesn't amount to better human rights, and I think that's antithetical to the EU. The last thing I would say is that antagonization could make things worse as a result. I'll take opening very quickly.
Sanction is forcing Russia to pop up Belarus. This is still a win for us because we can force Russia to expand the capital and military power, and we can also get US involvement too. Okay, Russia rich. Secondly, that's so sad that the EU, who are the bastion of human rights, are willing to make people starve so that Russia can lose a bit of money. What is the comparative? And this is our extensions. The first thing we say is that this is a reimagination of the world. Note, judges, if you don't buy this, it's actually fair, because this isn't a this house will lift sanctions motion as what OG was debating. It is a this house regrets motion. So we can reimagine the world and compare these worlds. Why does our world have solvency? We think that Lukashenko was not antagonistic at this time. This proves that he wasn't a villain till day one. It proves that the antagonization that the EU does makes these people, these types of dictators, more steadfast and power project more. A good example of this is Viktor Orban in Hungary. What we would say, and the benefits that we have, is that even though Lukashenko could potentially be a bad person, we would say that Lukashenko, firstly, would probably have not antagonized the EU. This means, firstly, they will allow more citizens to access the welfare fund, which is a tremendous benefit. But the second is that the EU isn't antagonized, right? Okay, as I conclude my speech, I just want to say that if it's true that the EU really cares about human rights, then they also wouldn't trade with people like Turkey. They wouldn't trade with people like China. The point here is that the EU is just an economic bloc, and as a result, both opposition premises are wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Gov Whip. Inviting opposition whip to finish off the debate. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Coolios. Let's go. Guys in the chat. There's a little bit of echo. Okay, cool. Thanks, Luke. All right. Oh, timer. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I'll prove to you why CO takes the debate, and I'll prove to you why CG has to take the fourth. Let's talk about why CO takes the debate, right? Firstly, let's talk about what Syakir said in his speech that wasn't responded to by closing government. We talked to you about how when it comes to Russia being prominent in this particular crisis is going to be harmful. And this is the metrics that we answer in closing government, because apparently to them, the metrics is the outcome of the debate will answer to that particular metrics, which is when it comes to outcome of Russian involvement in this particular state. If you actually have negotiations with Belarus, even if they wanted to reimagine the world, we'll still answer to that reimagination of the world, because look, that wasn't a very good reimagination, buddy. Like, let's talk about the negotiations, right? Like, the first thing is when it comes to harms of negotiation, and to some extent it also deals with opening government. When it comes to the things that Syakir mentions in his speech, Syakir mentions to you when it comes to Russian involvement after you are able to, like, after you held this discussion with Belarus, things like when it comes to Russia being able to use political puppeteering when it comes to Belarus, for instance. I think these things are likely to happen a lot more because Russia already has grips on Belarus, but also because Belarus is so dependent to Russia, they would likely going to allow Russia to influence their decision making when it comes to these negotiation terms. I think this is one that is very harmful because you allow another party to be able to be involved in this particular crisis. I think this is where the harm will be exacerbated. But second, it's just the idea of how at the end of the day, right, things like more demands are probably going to be coming from these negotiations. Like, if you allow them to have humanitarian aid crisis, and then you still want to trade with them, that means the next time they would have to want something from the EU, they can continue to do humanitarian crisis over and over again because they know this is the strategy that works when it comes to negotiating with the EU. And this is going to be a harm because, like I said, Russia is prominent there. Second, we talked to you about how hard power works. Apparently to CG, hard power only works because, well, it's just sanctioned. There's not much you can do. Let's talk about why sanctions is actually pretty good. And this is the reason why we win on this particular clash when it comes to why sanctions is better and why hard power actually does work. Firstly, let's talk about why hard power works, right? Because first, when it comes to hard power, I think the Belarus incentive is to make sure that their economy isn't isolated. The reason why this is true is because EU is the biggest buyer when it comes to, number one, the goods from Belarus. Even if Luke want to say that China trades with Belarus, we still think that the proximity allows for Belarus to have cheaper trade deals according to, like, with them than the EU. And this is a lot better because that means they could not trade off EU not being able to accept goods from Belarus, and this is going to be harmful for Belarus. That's why this is the incentive for them to not get sanctioned in the first place. Second, the migrant crisis is the exact response to Belarus' desperation after they were hit by these sanctions. The reason to this is because they are unwilling to, they have no other ways for them to be able to go against EU. That's why they are desperate. They use the migrant crisis for them to be able to have an equal playing field. I think this is a response that works. This means that, in particular, the outcome of the sanction actually does work. Even if they wanted to argue that this will take a long time, it still works and it doesn't exacerbate the problem that we say, because negotiation means you exacerbate the problem a lot more. Thirdly, inflation increases attack on Lukashenko, and this will lead to more protests. The reason why protests exist in the first place is because we have that particular sanction. That means the citizens of Belarus, the Belarusians, understand that they have EU for them to back them up when it comes to unfair elections, for instance. I think this is the thing that we should protect in the Belarusians' interest, because that means sanctions actually help the people of Belarus better in comparison to the world of government. That means if you follow the logic of government when it comes to having negotiations, I think Belarusians are likely going to be harmed a lot more. Lastly, is that they are willing to change some terms of the deal to separate migrants. This is not going to be helpful, because at the end of the day, you will not have the ability for you to be able to save all the migrants, because that means you're going to harm them at the end of the day. Second, let's talk about why CG doesn't win the debate and they take the force, right? Let's talk about this reimagination of the world. Apparently to them, we will have this world before sanctions ever existed. That means we have terms to negotiate with Belarus. They say that Belarus will still continue to steal election or rig elections. This means a few things. If they are still a dictator and they can still rig elections, I don't see the incentive for them to not be a dick to their citizens. That's the first thing. And this is worse because EU is going to help this dictator in particular that doesn't win any votes. This is not like Turkey, because Turkey actually wins votes. Erdogan wins votes. This is not the same. Secondly, there's no binding term analysis coming from closing government when it comes to what binds them to this particular term that was set by EU. The only thing that they say the term is don't engage with enemies of EU. But this doesn't mean anything. If they're a dictator and they're willing to go the distance when it comes to making sure that they are able to retain power in that particular country, they would go the distance to go against this particular term. You don't change anything in your reimagination of the world. That means everything that opening opposition said when it comes to harms exists. We just showed to you the link, and that's why we prove that CG gets a fourth, because apparently what they argue is similar to what was argued in opening government. Lastly, when it comes to why is it that it's not they cannot use the case study of Turkey in particular, because humanitarian crisis doesn't happen in Turkey, brother. in Turkey, what happens is that it's a particular war. It's a war between two opposing parties. In Belarus, it's people who were scapegoated because there's an interest. That's the difference. That's why EU has to intervene with Belarus, but doesn't intervene or supports Turkey at the end of the day. That's why they have to take the fourth. Go, CG.
Yeah, so our extension actually says that if EU aren't enemies, they wouldn't lock out people from their fund. They wouldn't have to retaliate because EU is an enemy, and the migrant crisis wouldn't have happened. The migrant crisis happened because of the hard power.
Look, the migrant crisis happened because of the hard power. I explained to you why royal reimagination can also lead to the same outcome, which is in status quo. Because if they disagree with EU sanctions or EU terms, they can just go to Russia, because Russia is probably willing to listen to them and are probably willing to lay them like some incentive for them to be able to win over Belarus. And this is something that's why I said your binding analysis needs to be there, because the terms that you said has no binding legal liability. That means you cannot bind like Belarus to listen to EU particularly. That's why you don't take the win at the end of the day, right? Let's talk about why we're different than opening opposition, because I think I already dealt with opening government because they don't have much anyways. Now let's talk about opening opposition, right? Why are we different than opening opposition? Opening opposition wants to argue about why EU is the moral bastion of the world, and like to some extent CG dealt with this, right? Why we say that this is more important, because when it comes to principally why the moral bastion thing is very important is because it shows to you that EU as a bloc cares when it comes to the economic crisis that happen, like the migrant crisis that happens around the world. It's not just because they are the bastion that they would likely go to hard power. It's also because of the harms that happens to people who were scapegoated. The difference here is, and we already showed to you the incentive when it comes to the outcomes as well, is that when it comes to Russian intervention or Russian being in that particular state, being in that particular agreement or crisis, it's going to harm EU and everybody else who are innocent in this particular crisis. At the end of the day, exacerbates the harm of the world. This is why we don't negotiate with dictatorships. We don't want Lukashenko to be able to have hands in the EU. With that said, very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Opposition Whip. Great debate, everyone. Would like to invite everyone to virtually cross floor and shake hands if that's possible. Also, thank you for the great debate. Would like to ask all debaters to leave the room for judges to deliberate.